Excellent. Well, hello everyone. This is my writer friend, Robb Grindstaff. We have known each other virtually for almost 15 years. We've worked together on some of my manuscripts, and he has worked with Carla on some of hers. And Robb and I have also co-taught for romance writers of Australia and America. And hopefully he's got some really good insights for all of you about writing and editing. And I have lots of your questions that you've prepared ready for him. So we might just start. Robb, can you please introduce yourself to the class and give us a quick overview of your career as a writer, both the journalism and the creative sides?
All right, certainly. My name is Robb Grindstaff, and I've just recently retired from a 40-year career in the newspaper and news media business, just where I spent my career and was fortunate enough to be able to do a lot of traveling and lived in other countries besides just America during that time. I have been a writer for as long as I can remember, but it's one of those things, life interferes. You get a job, you get a career, you get married, raise kids. And I'd always written on the side, but nothing serious after college until early 40s. And the fiction writing bug hit again. And I've been at it, pretty steadily ever since then. And about 15 years ago, I started editing. It was a good way to kind of merge my passion for writing fiction, which I'd written and studied for years, my career from the newspaper industry, which included being an editor. And so I started editing for friends and who were writers, and then that just grew and became almost a full-time job. Editing is how I support my writing habit. And my writing is a very American genre, usually described as contemporary Southern literary. But I've edited probably almost every genre of fiction. And I have editing clients from, of course, all over the US, Australia, two of which are here. And I've got editing clients from the UK and Europe and Canada and a few other places.
Oh, wow, that's
and when I retired and moved to the Midwest of the US 2 years ago, live on a lake and just write and edit full time now.
You're making us jealous. We'd love to write full time. Okay,
Okay, so we're going to ask some of the questions. This one's from Steve, is right?
Yeah. Yes.
So that the students have provided, and you can understand our accents, okay?
Oh, sure, if you can understand mine.
I can understand yours, but we have lots of TV, so we're used to it. You probably don't have as much Australian on your TV.
So Steve has asked, in relation to your journalism, Robb said that his experience in journalism is crucial to my fiction writing. Why and what has he learned?
Well, I'll say right up front, news writing and fiction writing are two very different animals, but they're both writing. Journalism, I think, teaches very basic writing skills, organizational skills, organizing your story, that crucial who, what, when, where, why, and how of organizing your thoughts and planning a story in a way that leads the reader through it from beginning to end. And journalism or news writing teaches, again, the very simple, basic, clear sentence structure, direct sentences, statements of fact, research, sources, quotes and attribution, which would be the news writing version of dialogue, when to put in a quote, and how to use that for maximum effect. News writing is straightforward. It's not fancy. You're not trying to impress anybody with your prose. You're trying to convey a story and hold the reader's attention. Most of my career was in the newspaper business. I've been in the news media business overall, mostly again in newspapers. So if you're reading a story in a newspaper, you probably have 4, 5, 6 other stories on the same page, competing for your attention. It'd be like if you're reading a book and you've got 6 other books with beautiful covers and really interesting titles laying on the desk in front of you. If you get bored with your book, it's easy to set aside and pick up one that looks better. So as a journalist, your job is to hold their attention, even though there are 4 or 5 other stories staring the reader in the face, vying for their attention. So you've got to be clear, concise, and lead the reader through the story paragraph by paragraph until they reach the end. Otherwise, if you lose them halfway through, they got bored, they decided they learned everything they needed to know about that topic. That's not what you want to have happen. And those skills translate to fiction writing quite well. One of the things that I always point out is, you're talking about journalists who become fiction writers. That includes names like Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, and Ernest Hemingway. So the skills translate well.
Great. So Steve has also got a quote from you. He's been busy, gone on to your website. So this is you, Rob. You said, "Write tight," my journalism professor said, and I heard that repeatedly from editors throughout my career. Be spare with words, write directly, simply, plainly, understandably. The fewer words, the better. So what the heck does write directly mean?
Maybe I wasn't direct enough with that.
Maybe you weren't.
It just means writing simple and straightforward, not fancy. You're not trying to impress anybody with your prose. You're not meandering around aimlessly, philosophizing and thinking beautiful thoughts. You're trying to hold a reader's attention. You're not trying to impress your creative writing instructor. One of the key things in journalism writing, news writing, that I believe carries over to good fiction writing is to let the writing be invisible. And the writer needs to be invisible. You don't want to constantly remind your reader that they're reading a book. You want them to get lost in the story and lost in the character. There's a famous writer, Elmore Leonard, and his writing advice was, if it sounds like writing, rewrite it, which I've always thought was a great quote. And that's all I mean by writing directly, is just simple, straightforward, tell your story and immerse your reader in it.
Well, I think you do a good job of that. Where's the echo coming from? I recently read an early draft of Robb's current work in production. It's called Turning Trixie, and the main character is a 23-year-old blonde, gorgeous Texan prostitute. And I'd be reading this, and I read a lot of it when I was in COVID lockdown, so I got hours of sitting and getting into it. And I would forget about you, Rob. I would forget this is you writing Trixie. I believed in her so much. And I think I mentioned, I sent you a comment at some stage to say, are you sure you're not a 23-year-old Texan prostitute? So I think that's a great example of the writer being invisible. So
yeah, no, I'm a little older than 23 now, so that can't be right.
25 at least.
At least.
Okay, so another question for you. Tell us about your journey to publication of your first novel. Is the experience of writing and publishing your novels different now that you've had several published?
Oh, how much time do we have? It was a years-long journey that still continues. But to focus just on that first novel, as I said, I'd already, I was in my early 40s when I started writing my first novel. Seriously, I'd made a few attempts before then that didn't go anywhere. And I was learning all about writing and specifically writing fiction. But I just had this character in my head that wouldn't shut up. I had to write down the story that she was telling me. Once I had it done and worked with writer groups and critique groups and an editor, and polished and revised and edited multiple times, and learned how to write a query letter to send to agents, literary agents, And over the course of about 3 years, I queried over 100, maybe 150 literary agents. And I must have had a good query letter because I got really good response to it. Generally speaking, if you send out a query letter to 10 agents, if one of them asks for a partial manuscript, that's pretty good. I was getting 7 or 8 requests out of 10 letters.
You want that query letter?
Yeah, it was really good. Out of the 7 or 8 that asked for partial manuscript, they would ask the first 5 chapters, the first 3 chapters, or whatever. Nearly every one of them would ask for the full manuscript. And when they did, they would ask for exclusive. They said, send it to me only. Don't respond to any other agents. Give me 6 weeks to read this and respond. And I did that over and over and over. I would get letters back and sometimes even phone calls, which was really very unusual, from agents saying, I absolutely love your book, but I don't think I can sell it to a publisher. It didn't have any wizards in it, or whatever the case was. It just wasn't something, it's literary fiction. It's not something they felt they could sell to a publisher at that time. But they'd always say, but keep me in mind if you write another book, query me on that one. And so I had really good response over a 3-year period, but no takers until eventually I landed a literary agent, which was the highlight of my writing career at that point. And he had some more advice and suggestions on making the book a little stronger, and they were really good suggestions. So I revised again, sent it back to him, and then got a nice note back from the agency telling me that my agent had left the business. And that they were taking on all of his clients, but they were overwhelmed, and so they were only taking on his clients who already had a publishing contract. And so they were unfortunately going to have to let me go. So that was like, that was kind of a kick in the pants. So I continued writing my second novel and started researching small publishing companies, and just found one that sounded good, sent them a query letter on my second novel. I'd shelved the first one and decided that maybe that was a practice novel. The publisher immediately offered me a contract on my second novel, which was Hannah's Voice. The second novel I wrote, the first novel I published. I talked to the publisher and the editor there and said, well, I have this other novel. And they said, well, let's take a look at that too. And they came back with a 3-book contract. They said, we'll publish Hannah's Voice. We'll wait a year and publish Carry Me Away, which was the first novel I'd written, the one I'd queried for 3 years. And they said, and then whatever your next novel is, we'll publish that one too. So altogether, that was about a 7-year process until I got a publishing deal and got books published. And I've been with them for 10 years now. They published my most recent novel, a collection of my short stories, and Turning Trixie, which will come out later this year.
Excellent. That's really good.
It was easy, so it was easy, is what I'm saying.
It's not a quick and easy path to publication, so it's good to hear about what you went through. So we're up to here, I think.
Yeah.
So it's another student question.
Yeah. So it's a long one. So would it be true to say that Robb doesn't make judgments about his characters? For instance, an interviewer asked Robb whether Slade was good or bad, and Robb declined to answer. Robb seems to trust his reader. Could you explain how to write an ambiguous character? Where is the line between being clear about who a character is and not giving away everything about them?
Okay. Well, in the novel Slade, which is my most recent novel, the character being ambiguous, was he a good guy or a bad guy, is part of the story. And so, A, I don't know, and B, if I did know, I didn't want to give it away because that's the whole point of this book, is for readers to make up their own mind. The other characters are all given their chance to tell what they think about Slade. And some loved him, some were non-committal, and some hated him, thought he was a con man, ripping people off, all of that. So again, it's there for the readers to make up their own mind in that particular case, which is a little different than, Slade's a very different novel than most things I've written. But I think that's true in any book you write. Whoever your main character is, your protagonist, you don't want them to be perfect. There are very few perfectly good people and very few perfectly evil people. We can think of a few historical examples, perhaps. But most people are, kind of a mix. Everybody's got their strengths, everybody's got their flaws. I think I could probably go find some people who will tell you that they love me and I'm wonderful. And I could also find some people who I've made, a few enemies over the years, who probably wouldn't be so kind. So bless their hearts, that's, but I think that's true for everybody. And so we need to make that true for our characters too. If your protagonist is too perfect, if her love interest is too perfect, they're not real. They don't feel real. If your antagonist, your villain, is pure evil, I mean, unless you're writing a supernatural story and he's a demon, but even then you can make a demon somewhat likable if you really want to. Hannibal Lecter and The Silence of the Lambs and all those stories. He was a pure evil guy who was very likable. Readers were rooting for him to kill and eat Dr. Chilton, right? And he was, charismatic. He was sophisticated. He was charming. It was all of those things at the same time that he was a serial murderer. And so by making your characters real, with flaws, with strengths, with likable characteristics, it makes them more realistic and readers can relate to them better.
That's good to hear. So a follow-up to that, Robb has written a book of short stories as well as novels. How does he know a story idea has got enough meat on it to make a novel versus a short story? Does Robb have a rule of thumb as to what is a short story or what is a novel? How does a writer know if one has too much material for a novel? I wish I had that problem.
There's several questions in there. But as far as knowing the difference, I know before I sit down and start writing, based on the idea that came to me, is it a short story or a novel? And I'm generally speaking, and there's lots of exceptions to this, but generally speaking, I guess you could compare a novel as a movie. A short story is a snapshot. It's a photograph. It's a point in time. Or maybe it's a 5-minute short film versus a 2-hour-long feature film. But again, before I sit down to start writing, I know which one I'm writing. I've never sat down to write a short story and then halfway through go, oh, this is getting more complicated. I'm just going to keep writing and pretty soon I have a novel. That's never happened to me. It does to some writers, though. I understand that. Or you have an idea for a novel and you're 10 pages in going, this is a good idea, but it's not going to carry out the whole weight of 300 pages. So I'm going to wrap this up. Those things just don't happen to me. I know right from the first word or before I've even written a word, what I'm dealing with as far as the idea. And generally speaking, a short story is, a single key event, and usually over a pretty short period of time, maybe one day, one evening, one dinner, maybe a couple of days. You might, in a short story, have some backstory that you fill in, but it's very small chunks, a paragraph or two here and there. Now, I have a short story that I think it's about 8 pages long or so, maybe 5,000 words, that covers 60 years. But most of that is in memory and flashback. The whole story is still centered around one key event on one day, and just flashes back to different points in time to fill in the gaps up to that point.
Is that the zombie story?
I'm sorry?
Is that the zombie story?
Yes, that's the one.
I'll have to give a copy to everyone. It's my favorite story.
Oh, wow.
The Desert Rain is the name of that one. So,
Yeah.
There's, and as far as, how long is a story, or what was the question about, how do you know if it's a short story or a novel, or if it's too short or too long? I mentioned Ernest Hemingway earlier, and there's a story about him that I think may be true, but it may be partly legend, and I may not be telling it exactly right. But he was living in the Florida Keys on an island, and a writer for the New York Magazine wanted to interview him. And Ernest said, sure, come on down to Florida and I'll meet you in this bar. And the writer makes the trip, probably by train back then, and is sitting at the bar interviewing Ernest Hemingway, and brings up some criticism that critics and reviewers had of Ernest Hemingway, is that his novels weren't long enough. Why do you write such short novels? Why are your stories so short? And Ernest said, hang on a second, said, let me borrow your pencil. And the reporter handed Ernest Hemingway his pencil, and Ernest Hemingway jotted a note on a napkin, turned the napkin around and shoved it across the table so the reporter could read it. And there were 3 lines. It said, for sale, baby shoes, never used. And Ernest Hemingway just got that sink in for a moment and said, a story needs to be as long as it takes to tell the story. And you have to let your readers fill in the gaps sometimes. You don't try to tell your readers everything. Let them fill in the story themselves. So basically, a story needs to be as long as a story needs to be. Now, when you talk about, you're writing a novel and you've got too much material. My first novel, Carry Me Away, when I finished my first draft, I had 160,000 words. With revisions and things I added and took out, I wrote over 300,000 words on that novel. The published novel came out at 92,000 words. So yeah, there was a lot of stuff that got stripped out and tossed out over the several years that I wrote and revised that. And that always reminded me of the story about Michelangelo, who carved this statue of David that's very famous. And somebody supposedly asked Michelangelo, how did you take a block of marble and make something so realistic? And Michelangelo said, easy. I just chipped away everything that didn't look like David. And I think that's what, as writers, we do with, I know I do. I write a lot more than I need. I write a lot of backstory. I write histories. I write scenes that I need to know that the reader doesn't need. And so it helps me learn the story. It helps me learn the characters. Then I have to boil it down to what do the readers need to know. And I take all that knowledge that I gained from writing 300,000 words about this character and just infuse that into the writing of 80, 90, or 100,000 words that the reader needs.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Need a water or anything?
Making all the work.
Yeah. Okay, so just a few more questions. So you work as an editor and mentor to emerging writers. What are the common issues and problems you encounter with newbie writers?
Oh, every writer is different. Of course, there's lots of different issues, and every writer has strengths and every writer has weaknesses. And it doesn't matter if it's a new, inexperienced writer or a much more experienced published writer. Everybody has strengths and everybody has weaknesses. I will say one of the things that we always focus on, well, what are your weaknesses? What do you need to do to strengthen that? One thing I always recommend to people is know what your strengths are as a writer and play to that. In my case, I have plenty of weaknesses, but I've been told over the years that one of my strengths is dialogue. So I didn't know why or how. I just wrote dialogue and people liked it. Editors, reviewers, publishers, whatever, seem to really focus on the dialogue. So my stories become very dialogue focused, by very character centric and dialogue focused scenes, because that's where my strengths lie. That way I can ignore my weaknesses. But or, let's see. Some of the, I'll just touch on three real quick. I know we don't have, tons of time, but three issues that I see repeatedly. And I keep basically a notebook of issues that I see all the time, and where I can have explanations and definitions and some examples on how to improve that. Then I use that in my editing. So three of the issues that I refer to most frequently are probably point of view and perspective issues, such as, if the point of view is inconsistent, or there's head hopping from one character to another, or the point of view is not deep enough and not internal enough to the character, or the writer violates the perspective, of the character, and just does something that jolts the reader out of the story. I see that a lot. And second, I guess, would be back to the dialogue, flat or unnatural dialogue, stiff. And this is one, again, where it was a strength of mine, but I didn't know why. But when I would edit people, I could say, oh, this guy writes really great dialogue, or this woman's dialogue is kind of flat and stiff and unnatural. But I couldn't say why. I wasn't sure, exactly what we had. So I studied it to try to figure it out, and interviewed a lot of writers about how they write dialogue. And I came up with one key aspect. When you're writing dialogue, to think about, are you writing a script? You're writing down the line that you want your character to say, then you're handing that piece of paper to your character and saying, here, read this. Or are you just listening to your character, letting them talk and take dictation? And then you can edit it later. It will be much more natural sounding if you just let your character talk. If you write it and hand it to them to recite a line, that's how it's going to sound. And if your character's dialogue sounds like it was written by somebody else, that may be what you're doing. The last point I'll hit, because I know this one is one of Samantha's favorites, is filtering.
Yes.
If your prose has a lot of I heard, she saw, he felt, he recognized, she noticed, I realized, what you're doing is you're filtering the story through the character's senses rather than putting your reader inside the character to experience it. Now, the easiest way to explain that, I think, is with an example. And I know our time is limited, so I'll be really quick here, but here's an example. The original is, when Joe heard the rattling, shaking sound, he looked down and saw the snake coiled on the path in front of him. He knew it was ready to strike. Joe felt the panic rise in his throat. That really short paragraph has 6 filters. Joe heard, he heard a sound, he looked, he saw, he knew, and he felt. Now you can rewrite that very easily and take out all of those filters, and it makes it much more direct to the reader. And it might sound like, the rattle and shake stopped Joe in his tracks. Coiled in front of him, the snake blocked his path, ready to strike. He stifled the little girl's scream that tried to escape.
Yeah, much better.
You don't have to tell somebody, the reader, that Joe saw something. You have to tell what it is Joe saw and let the reader see it at the same time that Joe sees it. And that's the key to eliminating filters.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think we've only got a few minutes before Zoom's going to kick us off. So I'll try and get into 2 last questions. This one is from Linda. She has said, Janet Ivanovich, when explaining her writing process, discussed the effort she puts into making her scene and summary portions work, but she also spends a lot of time and effort thinking about the transition process from scene to scene. Please offer any advice for transitioning scenes.
Well, there's probably dozens, if not hundreds, of ways to transition from one scene to another. I think you can boil it down to 2 key aspects, right? Okay, you got 2 scenes, you got to transition from one to the other. The first point is, when, where, and how does the first scene end? And the second point is, when, where, and how does the next scene begin? And I think you can really concentrate a lot on how a scene ends. You always want to end a scene in a way that thrusts the reader to turn the page and keep reading. You don't want to end a scene in a way that is so relaxed and resolved that the reader says, oh, this is a good time for me to set the book down and go to sleep. You want them to, oversleep and miss work in the morning because they couldn't put your book down and stayed up all night long reading. There's lots of ways to end a scene like that. I mean, there's the cliffhanger, an emotional high, introducing a new character right at the end of the scene, a big surprise or a twist right at the end of the scene, and lots of other ways. But some way to make the reader go, I got to keep reading. And then the second part is, where does the next scene begin? And really, you have two key spots there. You can pick up the next scene, like beginning of the next chapter, right where the previous one ended. Or you can start the next scene somewhere completely different and just ignore what just happened and go into a different scene, maybe a different place, different characters, make the reader wait for another chapter or another scene to get back to find out what happened at the end of that scene that had really piqued their interest. Your second scene might be a flashback to an earlier time that fills in some information that makes it make sense when you get back to the original scene. And there's lots of other ways, but that's the two key points to keep in mind, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Right, quickly getting one last one.
Okay, the last question: what pieces of advice do you think would benefit all new writers, I should say?
Let's see.
The last question, yep.
Yeah. Well, one piece of advice is always, give up now while you still have your sanity. But or you either have to do that, or you have to keep at it. And again, there's lots of advice people can give. One thing is, again, keeping at it. Any task or skill that you want to build, if you want to learn how to play the piano, you're not going to buy a piano today and be on stage at a concert hall next year. It takes hours and hours and years to build the skills, and writing fiction is no less complicated than playing classical piano. It really isn't. There's as many moving parts as there are piano keys, and you've got to learn by memory where they all are and how to use them properly. But so it's just keep writing, keep practicing, take lessons, take classes like this, hire an editor, join a writers group, all of those things. Just keep at it. It's worth it. I've heard the million word mark, that it's not muscle memory until you've written 1 million words of fiction. Another piece of advice I've heard is, write 4 novels and then throw the first 3 of them away, because that's about what it takes. But basically that's it. Just stay at it. Eventually, A, you're having fun, and B, you're creating something, and eventually there will be readers who will appreciate what you have, and they'll wonder, wow, you make it look so easy.
Thank you, Rob. That's all been really great advice and insight. So thank you for your time, and we'll let you get on with your evening.
Okay. Well, I hope to make it back to Australia again someday and meet you guys all in person.
That'd be great. All right.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.